Precisely because the distress of people in that situation is so real and so awful, we need to understand this problem in its full complexity. And we need to understand it in its full complexity because it's only when you understand what's causing a problem that you can solve it fully. I totally understand we need to approach people who are distressed and find it difficult to engage with the complexity in a spirit of love and compassion because they're right to feel the way they do. They've soaked up a huge amount of shame that they didn't deserve. You didn't design your brain and you didn't design this society either. You didn't choose to live in a world where your kids were being fucked with all the time by these technology companies and the food industry and all these other factors. So absolutely, we have to engage with the complexity. We've got nothing to fear from the complexity, but we have to take it step by step in a spirit of love and compassion.
Attention, focus, and distraction are words that if you have ADHD or you're suspicious that you might have ADHD, they might sit a bit uncomfortably with you because I myself have spent my entire life being told, stop getting so distracted. Why can't you pay attention to things? There's a lot misunderstood about ADHD when it comes to attention. We seem to have this ability to hyper-focus. And if it's a topic that we're particularly obsessed with, or if we have a deadline, we are able to be the most focused people in the room. We're able to go into tunnel vision states where we are just problem solvers and we get things done so efficiently. And I think where it becomes a bit of a problem, or at least in my own experience, is how to direct that attention. And today I wanted to speak to someone who has done a lot of research into attention. He has written the hugely popular book, Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention. His name is Johann. He's an absolute delight. And he went on a really long journey understanding different factors that have to do with attention, things like the maneuvers that the tech overlords all pull to take our attention from us, how attention has actually become a commodity, something that they can capitalize off of and something that they are stealing from you rather than you lacking willpower and having control over where that willpower goes. And the other thing I wanted to talk to him about was whether we are actually in any control whatsoever of being distracted and what things that we can do within our own lives, what control can we have over the way that we are getting distracted by various things. Johann, welcome to Cloud.
Oh, I'm so happy to be back with you guys.
It's so nice to be chatting with you again. We actually became friends such a long time ago. Your research on stolen focus, on all of our attention, it seems to be something that not only neurodiverse folk struggle with. Across the board, why can none of us pay attention anymore?
We're living in a massive society-wide crisis of attention. The average office worker now focuses on only one task for less than a minute. And for every one child who was identified with serious attention problems when I was 7 years old, there's now 100 children who've been identified with that problem. And I could feel it happening to me. You know, every year that passed, things that require deep focus that are so important to me, like reading books, even watching films, were getting harder and harder. They were getting more and more like running up a down escalator. Do you know what I mean? I could still do them, but they were getting harder and harder. And I was particularly worried about the young people in my life who I really love, who I could see were not forming attention in the way they needed to. And the reason this matters is I would just say to anyone listening, think about anything you've ever achieved in your life that you're proud of, whether it's starting a business, being a good parent, learning to play the guitar, whatever it is. That thing that you're proud of required a huge amount of sustained focus and attention. And when your ability to focus and pay attention breaks down, your ability to achieve your goals breaks down, your ability to solve your problems breaks down, you feel worse about yourself because you actually are less competent when you can't pay attention. Attention is our superpower as a species. And at the moment, we're surrounded by kryptonite, right? So when I went on this big journey all over the world to research this and interviewed over 200 of the leading experts on attention and focus, and did a really deep dive into their scientific research, what I learned is there's scientific evidence for 12 factors that can make your attention better or can make it worse. And loads of the factors that can make it worse have been hugely rising in recent years. Some of them are obvious. There's some factors in our technology, but they go really widely from the food we eat to the sleep we don't get, to the way our kids' schools work, to the way our offices work. There's a huge array of factors that are attacking our attention in a kind of perfect storm. And there are some people, the scientific evidence is very clear, there are some people who for biological reasons are more sensitive to these problems. But the way I've come to think about them is they're almost like canaries in the coal mine. they're being affected by the things that everyone else is being affected to, but just even more so. So actually, once you understand that you may have a bit more biological sensitivity to these problems, you need to be more attuned to the psychological and social factors that are undermining our attention and work with the rest of us to get these things out of our environment, not less. It's not like once you've got you know about the biology, you're like, oh, I'll just focus on that. It's even more important for you to know about the rest of the picture.
It's so interesting you bring that up, because I think for a lot of people who are diagnosed with ADHD, initially learning that there is a genetic component to it, and you know that when you go through a diagnosis process, a lot of it has to do with whether your parents exhibit signs of neurodiversity or maybe what could have led to you having it from a genetic perspective. I felt really like, oh, it's always been the way, you know, it's completely in my biology. There was nothing that I could have done about this. And as time has gone on, and I've obviously learned a lot more about the condition and about some of the factors that can exacerbate the symptoms of it, I've realized that I've had this quite innate defensiveness about, and I wonder whether that's me being invalidated, perhaps. Maybe I was medically gaslit, you know, my whole life being told like, oh, you know, you're just a bad kid, you know, you just need to pay attention more, you need to try harder, you need to do these things better so that you can achieve your goals and so that you don't get distracted. And I think it's interesting to talk about this blend between, you know, whether it is nature, nurture, whether it's brain or blame, as I've heard you speak about. I know that you spoke to a lot of experts about this. What did they agree on in terms of nature, nurture, and what did they disagree on?
In all the textbooks, you'll find something that is never actually explained to ordinary people that I think answers your question and for which the evidence is totally overwhelming. So the fancy term for it is what explains attention problems, and actually many things we experience, anxiety, depression, obesity, a load of things, is what's called the biopsychosocial model, which sounds complicated, but it's actually very simple. For all these things, there are three kinds of cause. There are biological causes, like your genes or changes that happen in your brain that can make it harder to go back. There's psychological causes, things like trauma. And then there's social causes, things like loneliness or financial insecurity. And all these factors are real. And when it comes to anyone who's experiencing attention problems, you'll have some biological, psychological, and social components. And they differ from person to person. So the way I started to think of them is picture like a bathtub with 3 taps. So one person might have a quite strong psychological tap. Maybe they've had a lot of childhood trauma, and a very low social tap, right? Maybe they don't have any financial insecurity, right? Other people will be completely different. You'll have a very low biological tap, but a very high social tap. Yeah, it differs. But it all swirls into the bathtub, and you are all that water that's come from those 3 different taps, right? And that makes up you. But what's happened is we've ended up telling a much more simplistic story. You know, one of the experts put it to me, in theory, we have a biopsychosocial model. In practice, we have a bio model. All we talk to people about is the biology. And people can initially experience, like you did, being told a story that's just about their biology as a real relief from shame. Because very often when we think about these issues, we're stuck in a kind of face-off. We think of it as blame or brain, right? Either it's blame, you're thick, you're lazy, you didn't work hard enough, or there's a problem with your brain. It's not your fault. You weren't thick and lazy. You had this deficit and we can help you now, right? And when someone comes along and talks about the biopsychosocial model and says, well, yeah, there is a biological contribution for some people, but actually it's more complicated than that. There's social factors, there's psychological factors. Actually, your genes get switched on and off by the environment and by what happens to you. Some people hear that at first as, wait a minute, so you're saying I am to blame. If it's not totally my brain, it must be there's something wrong with me. And you want to go, no, just like you didn't choose your brain, you didn't choose the society in which we live. You didn't choose the design of a school system that undermines our attention and disengages kids. You didn't choose a food system that screws up our brains. We can go down the whole list of things that I talk about in my book, Stolen Focus, that we didn't choose. You didn't choose the existence of these technologies that are designed by people in Silicon Valley to hack and invade our attention. So I think when we think about it in a more complex way, initially there's a moment of adjustment that can be very anxiety-provoking, where people hear things that are not being said, understandably. But the advantage of telling the complex truth is, A, it's true, and when you understand the broader picture, you can actually find the most meaningful solutions to these problems.
I completely agree with that. And I think that when I was initially diagnosed, when I did have that defensiveness around conversations like this, there was one that a Harvard psychiatrist named Dr. Chris Palmer, he has spoken a lot about how ADHD is linked to brain metabolism. And he speaks a lot about how diet and lifestyle can fix, and I'm putting that in quotation marks, can fix ADHD. And like I said, initially when I heard that, I was really defensive because I feel as though when you are neurodiverse and you've spent your whole life kind of experiencing this criticism of the way that you turn up to the world and some of your behaviors and things that you don't perceive to be doing wrong but other people don't like. And I feel as though I've turned a bit of a corner because now learning more about those things, learning about, the food dyes that you spoke about in your book, Stolen Focus, learning about different learning environments and distraction with technology and all those kinds of things, it's actually enabled me to have a more of a holistic approach where I feel more of a sense of hope now. And that wasn't there at the start. So what were some of those things that you learnt about from experts? What were some of the environmental factors that can exacerbate ADHD?
The key thing for people to understand is that your attention did not collapse. Your attention has been stolen from you by some really big and powerful forces. And once we understand them, wherever you are on that genetic spectrum, it will help you to get your attention and focus back. So you mentioned food. There's an amazing study that was done in Britain in the city of Southampton. They got 193 kids and they split them into two groups. And the first group was just given water to drink, and the second group was given water laced with the kind of dyes and additives that you find in loads of the food that we're all eating. And the kids were monitored. The kids that were given the dyes had significantly more problems sitting still. They were manic. They had trouble focusing, right? We're all exposed to that. And it's not just the dyes. Dale Pinnock, who's one of the leading nutritionists in Britain, explained to me a really important dynamic. So imagine every morning you have the standard British Aussie breakfast. You have like white toasted bread with butter on it, or you have sugary cereal. What that does is it releases a huge amount of energy really quickly into your brain. It releases a lot of glucose. And it's like, whoa, yes, I'm awake, I'm ready for the day. It feels great. But it releases so much glucose so fast that an hour and a half, 2 hours later, you'll get to your desk or your kid will get to their school desk and you'll have a huge energy slump and you'll have very low levels of glucose. And then you experience what's called brain fog, where you just can't think very clearly and you find it hard to focus until you have another sugary, carby snack. Then you get another boost of glucose, then it crashes again. As the way Dale Pinnock put it to me, is the way we eat puts us on a roller coaster of energy spikes and energy crashes throughout the day, which leaves us with these rolling patches of brain fog. To switch metaphor, he said it's a bit like what we're doing is putting rocket fuel into a Mini. It'll go really fast for 5 minutes and then it just conks out. But if you have the kind of fuel that we evolved for, if you have, for example, porridge with blueberries for breakfast, that releases energy much more steadily. You don't get these spikes and crashes. And of course, that's not a problem that happened just because of you and me. The entire food system has militated to move us towards these ways of eating that harm our attention. More 3-year-old children know what the McDonald's M means than know their own last name, right? So we're primed from the moment we're born to eat in this dysfunctional way. Certainly I have almost all my life. That's one example, but let's think about one of the really even bigger ones. I spent a lot of time for my book, Stolen Focus, interviewing people in Silicon Valley who designed key aspects of the world in which we now live. And the thing that most struck me is how sick with guilt they feel about what they've done to all of us. Give an example, there's a wonderful guy called James Williams who worked at the heart of Google. And one day he was speaking at a tech conference where the audience was literally the people who designed the stuff your kids are using today. And he said to them, if there's anyone here who wants to live in the world that we're creating, please put up your hand. Not one person put up their hand. And he's like, I'm done, I'm out of here. And when I spoke to the people who designed this world we live in, they kept explaining to me how and why this technology is undermining our attention and what we can do about it. And at first it felt very overwhelming, but then it took me to a very positive place. So if you open now TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, everyone listening, please don't, but if you did, those companies immediately begin to make money out of you in two ways. The first way is really obvious. You see advertising. Okay, no one needs me to explain that. The second way is much more important. Everything you ever do on these apps is scanned and sorted by their artificial intelligence algorithms to figure out who you are and what makes you tick. What makes you happy, what makes you sad, what makes you horny, what makes you angry. And if you've been on these apps for a while, they know tens of thousands of things about you. So let's imagine you've ever said on any of these apps that you like, I don't know, Pauline Hanson, Bette Midler, and you told your mum you just bought some nappies. Okay, it's going to figure out if you like Pauline Hanson, you're probably right wing. If you like Bette Midler and you're a man, you're probably gay. No disrespect to any straight men who like Bette Midler, I don't believe you, but okay. And you just bought some nappies, you've got a baby, right? Mm-hmm. It knows tens of thousands of things like this about you. It knows much more about you than your neighbours or your colleagues. And it's learning that information for lots of reasons, but the main one is it's figuring out what to show you next that will keep you scrolling. Because every time you open the app and begin to scroll, they begin to make money because you see ads. The longer you scroll, the more money they make because the more ads you see. And every time you close the app, their revenue stream disappears. So all this genius in Silicon Valley, all this AI, all these algorithms is geared towards one thing and one thing only, figuring out how do we get you to open the app as often as possible and scroll as long as possible. That's it. One of them said to me, just like the head of KFC may be a perfectly nice woman, but all she cares about in her professional capacity is how often did you go to KFC this week and how big was the bucket you bought? And if you become obese and get diabetes, that ain't her problem. In the same way, all these companies care about is how often did you open the app and how long did you scroll? And all of their machinery is designed to keep you addicted, to frack and harvest your attention as long as possible. As my friend Tristan Harris, who was at the heart of this machine for a long time, said, you can try having self-control, but every time you do, there are 10,000 engineers on the other side of the screen working really hard to undermine your self-control. So it cannot be a coincidence that we are spending on average 6 hours a day exposed to technologies that are designed to harvest our attention. And lo and behold, we're all struggling with attention problems. And I think in that context, to say it's just a biological problem in our brains that was there all along and no one noticed is not credible. Doesn't mean there aren't biological contributions, doesn't mean there aren't people who, due to their biology, are more sensitive to these problems. There are. But clearly these environmental factors are supercharging it. And wherever you are on that biological spectrum, this is negatively affecting you. And once you understand that, it opens up a whole set of solutions. So for all of the factors that are undermining our attention that I write about in Stolen Focus, there are two levels at which we've got to deal with them. I think of them as defense and offense. There are loads of things we can do as isolated individuals to protect ourselves and our children against these factors that are harming our attention. I'll give you an example of one, I'll go through loads in the book. I own something called a K-safe. It's just the letter K followed by safe. It's very simple. Anyone can buy them online. It's a plastic safe. You take off the lid, you put in your phone, you put on the lid, you turn the dial, and it locks your phone away for anything between 5 minutes and a whole day. I use it for 3 hours a day to lock my phone away so I can do my writing. I won't have my friends round for dinner without all of us putting our phone in the phone jail. It's really hard at first, but I always say to people, the pleasures of us actually listening to you and you actually listening to us are so much greater than whatever shitty update you're going to miss from Instagram and you're going to pick up 2 hours from now instead of now. And people often go like, oh, what if there's an emergency? And I go, so you do remember like the first half of our lives, when you left your house, you were just like, no one could contact you until you came home. We didn't all die, right? We were okay, right? So there are loads of things we can do like that at an individual level. But I want to be really honest with people because I don't feel most people who are communicating about attention are leveling with people. I am passionately in favour of these individual changes. They will make a huge difference to your life. On their own, they won't totally solve the problem. Because at the moment, it's like someone is pouring itching powder over us all day. And then at the end of the day, they're leaning forward and going to us, hey, mate, you should learn to meditate. Then you wouldn't be scratching all the time. And you want to go, fuck you. I'll learn to meditate. That's really valuable. But you need to stop pouring this itching powder on me, right? So we have to go on offense against the forces that are doing this to us. And that sounds very like, oh, good luck with that, mate. But I'll give you an example in the history of this country, in the history of Australia, that has improved the attention of every single person listening today. You go back to the 1980s, the late 70s, the early 1980s. The only form of petrol that was available was a leaded petrol. And it was discovered by scientists that exposure to lead was really bad for people's brains and particularly bad for children's ability to focus and pay attention. In fact, if you go all the way back to the early 1920s, there was an amazing female scientist who, before they introduced leaded petrol, predicted this is what would happen, and she was mansplained out the room, and they launched leaded petrol, and we had this disaster for 70 years. And of course, if lead was in petrol, it was in the fumes, it was in the air, everyone was breathing in loads of lead. So what happened was a group of ordinary mums, what at the time was called housewives, banded together and said, well, why are we allowing this? Why are we allowing these for-profit led companies and the petrol industry to screw up our kids' brains? And it's really important to notice what these mums didn't say. They didn't say, so let's get rid of cars, let's all go back to horses and carts. Just like none of us are saying, let's get rid of all technology, let's all join the Amish. No disrespect to any Amish who are listening. If you are kind of cheating, but never mind. What they said is, let's get rid of the specific thing that's screwing up our kids' brains and replace it with something that does the same job but doesn't screw up our kids' brains, right? And these mums fought like hell for their children. And it followed the classic pattern of all political struggles that was described by Mahatma Gandhi. First they ignored them, then they laughed at them, then they fought them, then they won. As everyone listening knows, there's no more leaded petrol in the whole of Australia. As a result, the average Australian child is 5 IQ points higher than they would have been had we not banned leaded petrol. Every person listening to this is smarter and less likely to commit violence, by the way, because exposure to lead makes you more disinhibited and more violent. It's why there was a huge increase in the murder rate in the 1970s. That, to me, is a really great model for what we need to do now. In addition to all the things we need to do at an individual level to protect ourselves from these factors, we need to take on these forces. One of them is we need to regulate social media. I go through in the book how the people who designed it explain how we could regulate it so it wouldn't harm our attention in the same way. We've got to deal with the food industry. We've got to change how our kids' schools work. We've got to change how our offices work. There's a whole array of factors we've got to go through as a society that can deal with this, but we absolutely can do that. But it requires a shift in psychology. We need to stop being angry with ourselves and stop being angry with our kids and blaming them. There's nothing wrong with you and there's nothing wrong with our kids. There's something wrong with the environment. But together we can fix the environment, right? But it requires us to realize we are not medieval peasants begging at the table of King Musk and King Zuckerberg for a few little crumbs of attention from their table. We are the free citizens of democracies and we own our own minds and we can take them back if we want to. But it also helps us to see how telling a purely biological story lets all these forces off the hook, right? I stress again, the biological contribution is real. Some people are more sensitive to these problems because of their biology. But if we tell an entirely biological story, or just all of our brains happen to malfunction at the same time as these invasive technologies, at the same time as this transformation in the food system, at the same time as this change in our kids' schools, at the same time as the fact that we sleep 20% less than we did before, you go down this list, that's letting all the forces that did this to us off the hook.
I also think that it kind of comes back to this narrative that we've been speaking about a couple of times, that initially when you hear those things, you can feel as though, well, these big tech companies are so large and so powerful and they're in control of so much. What the fuck can I do to change any of this on an individual level? But after reading your book, something that I actually did do, and this would be about a year ago now, I stopped wearing an Apple Watch. Because I realized that I would be working and I would get a zzz literally on my wrist. Every single time I would get a notification, it would take my attention away from what I was doing, which is a problem that I have already. So it just exacerbated the problem. The problem would be is that I would get a notification that I would have an Instagram message. And so I would go on and the message might be beneficial for me to read. But then 25 minutes later, I'd be like, how did I end up in this scroll hole? How was I here for so long? And it's these algorithms that are designed specifically for me to keep me there.
It's funny that one of the facts that I learned for the book that most haunts me is there's this guy called Professor Michael Posner at the University of Oregon who discovered, if I got a text message now, you could think, I could just glance at it for a second. That takes 3 seconds to glance at it. I'll be back at you. Professor Posner discovered if you're interrupted by something as simple as a text message, it takes you on average 23 minutes to get back to the level of focus you had before you were interrupted. But most of us never get 23 minutes without being interrupted. So we're constantly operating at this lower level of cognitive capacity. But I'm really sure what you said about people hear this and they think, what can I do about it? What can I do? And there's loads of those individual changes. I'm really glad you made that one. I made loads as well. Because it's easy to hear this environment is besieging our attention and systematically undermining it. And go, oh, fuck, we're just trapped in the matrix then, right? And whenever I think that, this might sound a bit weird at first, I think about my grandmothers, who I really loved. So when my grandmothers were the age I am now, I'm 45, one of them was a Swiss peasant woman living in a wooden hut on the side of a mountain, and the other one was a working class Scottish woman living in a tenement. When they were the age I am now, neither of them was allowed to have a bank account in their own names because they were married women. They had to be in their husbands' names. it was legal for their husbands to rape them, as it was legal in every country in the world for a man to rape his wife. My Swiss grandmother wasn't even allowed to vote. And my grandmother's lives were totally disfigured by sexism and misogyny. They never got to be the people they could have been. You know, my grandmother loved to paint and draw. She was told, shut the fuck up and get into the kitchen when she wanted to paint and draw. At the end of her life, she found it too saddening to paint and draw because of this life she could have had, right? And when my grandmothers had their lives disfigured in this way, they thought, well, this sucks. They hated that their brothers got to go to school longer than they did. But they thought, well, this is just the way the world is. This is the way it's always been. The power against is so great because feminism had not happened in the places where my grandmothers lived. I mean, it was happening in some parts of the world, but it wasn't happening in the places where they lived. Now, even the craziest misogynist, if I think about my niece, Erin, who just turned 20, it was her birthday yesterday, if even the most barking mad right-wing candidate in this country said on Twitter that she shouldn't be allowed to have a bank account and she shouldn't be allowed to vote and it should be legal for her husband to rape her, they would have to resign, right? When my niece loved to paint and draw, we didn't tell her to shut the fuck up and get into the kitchen. We Googled art schools, right? I don't want to underestimate how much further we got to go, and I'm very conscious I'm a man mansplaining this to you and you know much better than me. I think where we are with attention now is where my grandmothers were when they were the age I am now. We think, well, this sucks, we hate it, but what can we do? There's nothing we can do. This is just the way the world is. This is just the modern world. The powers against us are too great. And I'm here to tell you, yes, it sucks. Yes, the powers against us are great, but we can take on those powers. And I went to places that have done it, from France to New Zealand. I've seen how it's begun. We don't have to tolerate this being done to us. We own our own minds. We can fight back. And we have to fight back at so many levels, in our homes, in our kids' schools, in our offices, at a national and indeed global level. But we absolutely can do that. And the fact that your life is completely different to your grandmother's life and my grandmother's lives in so many positive ways is proof. You know, however powerful these forces that are harming our attention may seem, they're not a tenth as powerful as men were when my grandmothers were the age I am now. Men controlled every company, every country, every police force, every army, and they had done for 2,000 years, right? If those forces could be taken on and to some degree tamed, absolutely these forces affecting our attention can. And women were only 51% of the population, admittedly pretty big. Attention is affecting 100% of the population, right? Our constituency for this fight is everyone, except Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. And even they, by the way, would be happier. They might be a little bit less rich, but they'd be happier if we won as well.
I can handle them being a little bit less rich.
Exactly.
I think they'll be just
okay.
fine.
They're not going to be living in a box under a bridge, right?
Absolutely.
They'll be okay.
And I think some of the other things that I really loved about what you wrote in Stolen Focus that had to do with ways that we are able to reclaim, you know, a bit of control over this attention. It's been written for many, many, many years that people with ADHD very often struggle with sleep. And I learned that that is not specific to people with ADHD anymore. You know, it seems as though we're all having a lot of problems with sleep. What did you learn from experts about distraction, sleep, and how one improves the other?
The figures on this are kind of mind-blowing. The average person now sleeps 20% less than they did a century ago. The average British child sleeps 85 minutes less than they did a century ago, which is extraordinary. I interviewed the leading expert on sleep in the world, an amazing man named Dr. Charles Czeisler. I interviewed him at Harvard Medical School, where he works. And he said to me, even if nothing else had changed except that we sleep so much less, that alone would be leading to a really big crisis in attention and focus. There's lots of reasons why, but one really blew my mind. The whole time you're awake, your brain is building up something called metabolic waste. One other expert calls it brain cell poop, which helps you to think about it. It's just building up and building up. And when you go to sleep, when you get into deep sleep, your cerebral spinal fluid channels open and a watery fluid washes through your brain and carries this brain cell poop out of your brain, down into your kidneys and eventually out of your body. If you don't sleep 8 hours a night, your brain literally doesn't clean itself properly. You are clogged up. You have a feeling when you're tired and you feel clogged up? It's not a metaphor. You are actually clogged up. If you stay awake for 19 hours, which in my current jet lag state doesn't sound like much, your attention deteriorates as much as if you got legally drunk because of this clogging up of your brain. We're all going around much more clogged up than we used to be. And this is really negatively affecting our sleep and our attention. And there's another thing that I think will help people who want to improve their sleep that really blew my mind. We evolved to have something called a second surge of sleep when things get dark. So to understand that, imagine that you're on a camping trip, which is my idea of hell, but imagine
Yeah,
you did it.
same.
Literally
Why would you
hell.
pay to live worse than what you actually
Exactly.
do?
I've been to refugee camps. I don't want to voluntarily become a refugee, but someone out there, I know Aussies like their camping trips. Imagine you go camping and it starts to get dark and you've not put your tent up yet. As it gets dark, you will get a surge of energy. And you can see how that, in the circumstances where we evolved, that would be a great benefit to you, right? You're like, oh, okay, you've got a surge of energy. That means you can put up your tent. It means you can get back to the cave. It means you can get back to the group. So we evolved when it gets dark to get a surge of energy so that we could get to safety. But now we live in an environment where that's totally scrambled. So imagine you're lying in bed and you're watching Schitt's Creek and you turn off your phone and suddenly you're in darkness because you're like, oh, I was tired. I'm going to go to sleep. The message your brain gets is, oh, it just got dark. I need to give her energy so she can get back to the cave. It doesn't know you're already in the cave. You're already in safety. So you were tired.
Unless
you
you're
turned
in
off your
the
phone.
tent.
But you say, exactly, well, that's horrific. But so you'll suddenly get this surge of energy and you wake up again. And you're like, shit, but I wanted to go to sleep. I was tired, right? This is why it's really important to limit exposure to bright light in the hours leading up to going to sleep. But actually, we live in an environment where we do the opposite. We watch glowing screens immediately prior to going to sleep, which is screwing with us.
Yeah, and from what I've learned about like blue light glasses and turning things to yellow light and that kind of thing, it seems a little bit pseudoscience-y for me to even factor it in as something that could potentially help. That is something that I personally have really, really struggled with my sleep. And it's something that a lot of people with ADHD struggle with, especially if they're medicated, because obviously having stimulants can create a little bit of an environment that's not conducive with sleep. It's something that a lot of people need to work with their psychiatrists about, potentially some other alternatives or some other options that they're able to have. The last thing I wanted to talk to you about was a misconception that you wrote about in the book, and that is to do with medication, and particularly in children, but I think it happens a lot now, particularly with late diagnosed people, where there's been this notion that if you think you have ADHD or if you think your kid has ADHD, pop them on the medication and see what happens. If they go crazy, they don't have ADHD. If they seem calm, if they're able to focus more, they likely do. And I really like that you broke this down with experts and you kind of debunked the fact that this was a fair way to test whether someone did have ADHD.
Yeah, this really fascinated me. So I believe, like everyone else, so many people have been told this, a good way of testing if someone has ADHD is if you give Ritalin to someone who doesn't have ADHD, they'll become manic and wired. But if you give it to someone who does have ADHD, they'll focus more. It turns out that's just not true. Everyone becomes more focused and wired when you give them stimulants. So that's just wrong, right? Literally everyone becomes more focused if you give them a powerful stimulant. It's why people who take cocaine go on these long, boring monologues, by the way, because they're so hyper-focused on their own internal voice, right? So that's just a complete misconception. There is a legitimate debate about the drugs. I think we should be much more cautious than we currently are about giving them to children. It's utterly chilling that there is no long-term research on giving these drugs to children. We know it restricts their growth. But when you consider in the US, you're talking about millions of children are being given powerful stimulant drugs. And there's really no attempt to think about the deep underlying problems. That worries me. I'm not saying that we should never give the drugs. And for adults, I think it's a different calculation because our brains are more formed. But, I'll give you an example of a wonderful man named Dr. Sami Tamimi. He's a psychiatrist in the English town of Lincoln. And he took over a doctor's practice. And there were like 40 kids who were being given stimulants for ADHD. And he thought, this is a really big deal. If an adult who's not a doctor gives stimulants to kids, we send them to prison for a really long time. So I'm going to take this seriously. So he called in all the kids and interviewed them in depth. And he discovered that loads of them had developed their attention problems in the aftermath of their dads abandoning them, just disappearing from their lives. I thought, So he'd speak to the kids and they really missed their dads and they'd become more chaotic. They were very angry that their dads had abandoned them. And he said, I'm going to try a different approach. He phoned their dads. He said, hi, I'm your son Aidan's doctor. Your son really misses you. Could you come and see him once every week from now on? And a lot of the dads got more involved in their lives. As they did, in a lot of cases, the kids' attention and behavioural problems went away. He said it wasn't an attention deficit disorder, it was a dad deficit disorder. Now, that's not true of every child. There's other things going on in children's lives. But I think it's a good example of how when you think about the problem in a more complex way, you get more complex and effective answers. But what we have, my worry is that what we've been doing with attention, rather like what we've been doing with depression, addiction, anxiety, all sorts of things, is we have a psychiatric model that's based on identifying tropical diseases. If you've got malaria, I can do a little test, figure out if you've got malaria. I don't want to talk to you about your childhood. I don't want to know about your dad. It's irrelevant. You've got malaria, right? But what we do is we treat these much more complicated biopsychosocial phenomena as if they're like malaria, as if they're just a simple thing where, oh, you've got this thing, okay, we'll give you this drug that treats it, right? And human distress and human behavior is much more complicated than tropical diseases. And it needs to be understood in a context. Doesn't mean there's no value for drugs. Of course there can be value for drugs. But it needs to be understood in a complicated way. And often the best solution is something outside a purely biological intervention. So we need to understand these things in a much more complicated and truthful way. I want to expand the menu of options. Absolutely, drugs should remain on the menu of options, right? I don't want to take them off. But there needs to be a big, broad menu of options, particularly for children.
Yeah, I completely agree with this. And I think, that initial defensiveness that I spoke about when I heard experts saying like a lot of environmental factors can exacerbate this. I can only imagine how much greater that sense of responsibility would feel if it was my child. Really enjoyed reading about this in your book with psychiatrists who kind of referred to medication more as a Band-Aid. For me personally, it's probably going to be a Band-Aid that I wear for a very long time,
Sure.
but I have adjusted other things in my life to try and help alleviate the need for that medication. Thank you so much for everything that you have taught me about distraction. I would love to talk to you for so much longer. And thank you for having these quite complex discussions. I know that, particularly with ADHD, a lot of the conversation about, wanting to question more of how we are medicating so many children and how we're only providing this one solution for people for a much more complex condition. It's something that I think a lot of people struggle to communicate because they feel as though they're going to be called ableist. They feel as though they're going to be told that they don't understand what it's like from the perspective of someone who actually does experience it. And I really enjoyed reading how you question the people who are making these decisions and question their motives and the reasons for why they have landed on that particular solution. I appreciate the fact that you ask the questions because I don't think many people do.
Well, precisely because the distress of people in that situation, adults and children, is so real and so awful, we need to understand this problem in its full complexity. And we need to understand it in its full complexity because it's only when you understand what's causing a problem that you can solve it fully, right? So we need to build the most accurate map of how we got here so that we can build the most accurate map of how we get out of here, right? And I totally understand we need to approach people who are distressed and find it difficult to engage with the complexity in a spirit of love and compassion because they're right to feel the way they do. They've soaked up a huge amount of shame that they didn't deserve. You didn't design your brain and you didn't design this society either. You didn't choose to live in a world where your kids were being fucked with all the time by these technology companies and the food industry and all these other factors. So absolutely, we have to engage with the complexity. We've got nothing to fear from the complexity, but we have to take it step by step in a spirit of love and compassion.
Thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Hooray.